Okay, hello everybody. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the Walt Pavlo case. And I've heard Walt speak a couple of times, and he's really interesting character. I think he's pretty contrite about what happened. I've listened to other fraudsters, and they basically said, I'd do it again if I could. But Walt seems pretty contrite. But to give you a little background on his story, you've read, hopefully you've read the Ring of Thieves article and then watched the Nightline video about him. But he had an interesting case. His job, like he mentioned in the video, was to collect money for MCI. And so what happened was a lot of these companies that he was trying to collect money from were credit card, or not credit card, but they were calling card companies. So if you remember back in the day, if you had a calling card, you might be able to call a number, and then they would charge you like 10 cents a minute, to call long distances back before everybody had cell phones. So they would charge you 10 cents a minute, and then they'd rent the line from MCI for like 8 cents a minute. So they would make 2 cents every time you talked on the phone long distance. Well, there's also other companies that were running lines from MCI. So like 1-900 numbers. So phone sex, Miss Chloe, where you're trying to get your fortune told. They were also using MCI's lines, and they were customers were calling up these 1-900 numbers, being on the line for a long period of time, and the company, the 1-900 company, like Miss Chloe, may be charging like 25 cents a minute and then paying 10 cents a minute to MCI to utilize their line. Well, you can imagine a lot of these companies are probably not well run, and when MCI would send them the bill, they wouldn't be able to pay because they'd spent the money on something else. And a lot of these calling card companies were fronts for criminal agencies. So maybe a drug cartel or something would set up a calling card company and to try and launder the money so it looked like it came from a legitimate source. And so Walt was going around the country trying to collect from a lot of these calling card companies and 1-900 companies. And he mentioned like one case where he went to it was like an apartment in New York, and he shows up and he looks inside the door, and it's supposed to be the headquarters of this calling card company. Well, there's like people in there with guns. There's a money counting machine that's running, and he recognized pretty quickly that this is an organization that's probably not going to pay MCI. It's probably a front for a criminal organization. So he goes back to MCI and he tells them that a lot of these companies that he's trying to collect from are just not going to pay. So he's contacted them. They're either out of business. He thinks they're criminal organizations. But after all attempts to collect, he realizes they're not going to pay. And so he tells MCI, look, we need to write off, X millions of dollars in accounts receivable because it's uncollectible. Well, of course, MCI doesn't like that. They don't want to write off that much money. So they tell Walt, well, this is your job to collect it. You have to go out and collect this money. That's your job. That's what we're paying you to do. So Walt realizes it's uncollectible, but they also tell him that they have a budget and they're only going to write off so much uncollectible account, and he needs to stay within that budget. So, he knows that this money is uncollectible. So he goes about and devises ways in which to make the money look like it's collectible. So for some of these 1-900 companies, they want to stay in business. So he tells them, look, if you sign a note and promise to pay us in a year with interest, then that'll be fine. So then he would convert accounts receivable to notes receivable to look like it's still collectible, even though it's unlikely they're going to pay a year from now with interest. He would also take unapplied cash, so when customers would pay, but they wouldn't send back the remittance advice, so he wasn't quite sure who paid the money. And when that happens, you have to call the company back and try and figure out what invoices are being paid. Well, he would use any unapplied cash and apply it to these old invoices that were unlikely to be paid, at least for a short period of time. It looked like he was collecting the money. So he had all these tricks. He called it MBA's Gone Wild, where Walt and a bunch of his cohorts would sit in a room and try and figure out ways to make it look like uncollectible accounts were actually collectible so they wouldn't have to write them off. And so he was going around trying to collect money, traveling all around the country trying to collect money from these calling card companies, these 1-900 number companies that weren't paying him. And that's when we get into Ring of Thieves, where he winds up talking to an individual and says, everybody's making money here except you, Walt. I'm making money because I'm one of these people who aren't paying you. So I'm keeping the money that I collect and not paying MCI. Your bosses are making money because they've got stock options and stock at MCI, and their stock keeps going up, and they're making money. And if they were writing off all this bad debt expense, then their net income wouldn't be nearly as good, and their stock wouldn't be worth as much. So they're making money. The only one who's not making money is you. You're getting squeezed. So that's when Walt was convinced to go into this scheme to defraud some of these companies that he was trying to collect money from. And then he also, after he goes to jail, he realizes that, obviously that he made a big mistake. And he's sitting in jail and he says, you know what? I was just so stupid. I just never should have done that. And he finds out that MCI gets acquired by WorldCom. And he says to himself, gosh, if I just would have held out for, a few more, another year or so, and we would have gotten acquired by WorldCom, it would have become WorldCom's problem, all this uncollectible accounts. And as part of WorldCom's book, maybe it would have been minor and they would have written him off anyway, so we wouldn't have had to worry about it. And I would have gotten WorldCom stock and I would be, rich. I never should have done this thing. Then he says, well, nothing makes you feel better than seeing people in positions that are worse than you. And so he finds out what's going on at WorldCom with Bernie Evers and the like, and they all go to jail. And he says, man, I feel the pressure that was on me, and you ratchet that up 100 times, and that must have been what the folks at WorldCom were feeling. And so, it's a sad story, but in the end, you can see how people who commit fraud, start off as generally good people, but there's a lot of pressure that gets put on them. They feel that pressure, they see that opportunity, and they just have to rationalize what they're doing, right? And Walt is able to rationalize that, everybody's making money but me, right? And so I'm entitled to this money. I'm not doing anything different than anybody else is doing, right? And that's how he's able to rationalize that. We'll talk about the fraud triangle throughout the course of this semester, and we'll find out that opportunity, incentive, and rationalization are what leads to fraud, right? So Walt had the opportunity to do it because he was the MCI accounts receivable collector. Right, so he's able to manage these accounts and show them as collectible even though they weren't. And then he had the incentive to do it because his buddy convinced him that he can make a lot of money. He had this money squirreled away in Cayman Island accounts, and then he just needed to be able to rationalize it. And he rationalized that nobody's getting hurt. I'm doing what everybody else is doing. Right, this is what everybody's doing. What I'm doing. Right? So he just able to rationalize it. So. Part of this exercise is to go on the discussion board and just give your comments about, how you think Walt must have felt, and what are the things, the situations, and the feelings that he had that led him to commit this fraud. And if you could see yourself potentially getting into a scenario like this, because I think there's a lot of good people out there, and, and which is all of you, ethical people. But the reason why they do unethical things is because they get in a situation where they're able to rationalize poor decisions, and they don't think of the long-term ramifications of their short-term decision making, right? And so, post on the board your thoughts on the Walt Pavlo case. It's a really interesting read on the Ring of Thieves and watching the Nightline video and seeing him tell his story. But we want to talk about the rest of the semester about how seemingly good people get in a position where they commit fraud.